My mother rolled her eyes the instant I stepped into that Washington courtroom. Not subtle, the kind of exaggerated eye roll that practically shouted, "Here we go again." Like my presence alone was an inconvenience in her carefully curated victim act. But then, Judge Lawson paused mid-page, his fingers tightening around his pen as his eyes met mine. I could see the recognition strike him like a lightning bolt. "Wait," he said slowly, lowering the papers to the bench. "These charges, they're against you? You're the defendant?" My parents sat there in matching confusion, whispering frantically, utterly clueless. They didn't recognize who I had become. And honestly, that made what followed even sweeter. Because I wasn't just their forgotten daughter. I was the chief prosecutor who'd spent the last decade locking up people exactly like them. Selfish manipulators who thought rules didn't apply. Let me take you back 32 years. I was 3 months old when my mother, Carla, decided motherhood was a cage. She was 18, freshly graduated from high school in Spokane, Washington. My father, Ethan, was chasing dreams on the ice as a rising player for the Seattle Thunderbirds. A crying baby didn't fit the glossy lifestyle they wanted to broadcast, so they did what selfish people always do. They passed the responsibility to someone else. One cold October morning, they left me on my grandparents' porch in Portland, Oregon, with a diaper bag and a short note that said, "We'll visit soon." They didn't. My earliest memory is standing on a stool in Grandma Miriam's kitchen, maybe 4 years old, dumping too many chocolate chips into cookie dough. She'd laugh instead of scold, saying, "The best cookies have extra sweetness and extra patience." Grandpa Robert would come home, still wearing his judicial robe from the Oregon Supreme Court, scoop me up and ask about my day like I was the most important person alive. They never said a bad word about my parents. Not once. When I asked why Mom and Dad didn't live with us, Grandma would sigh softly and say they were busy with important things. I believed her because kids believe the people who love them. But even then, I wasn't blind. I noticed how other parents filled the bleachers during soccer games at Portland Field while mine never showed. How my classmates bragged about big Thanksgiving dinners while I spent the holidays with 2 gentle souls who went to bed at 8. The rare visits from Carla and Ethan followed a pattern. Christmas, sometimes my birthday. Carla arrived in her designer boots from Pike Place Market, kissed the air near my cheek, and spent the whole visit scrolling through her phone. Ethan never left the car, engine running, horn ready. The few times Grandpa forced him inside, the silence was thicker than courtroom tension. Here's the part nobody knew. Grandpa sent Carla $3,000 a month starting when I was born. Over 20 years, that added up to more than $800,000. She took every cent. No visits, no calls, no gifts, just more requests for money every time Ethan's latest business collapsed. The hockey bar in Tacoma that lasted 10 months. The training academy that never opened. The memorabilia store that filed bankruptcy before year 2. When Grandma Miriam died suddenly of a stroke, one Thanksgiving weekend, I was 18 and a freshman at University of Oregon. I drove home 6 hours in tears to find Grandpa sitting in the dark garden, holding the bulbs she'd planned to plant. We sat there until sunrise, silent. Carla and Ethan came to the funeral, stayed through the service, left before the reception. That was the moment I stopped making excuses for them. The moment I learned that blood doesn't bind you to selfish people. After Grandma Miriam's death, something shifted between Grandpa and me. Quietly, profoundly. We became partners in survival. Every Sunday night, we sat at the same oak table, sometimes eating his famous Oregon pot roast, sometimes my clumsy recreations of Grandma's handwritten recipes from her fading recipe cards. Sometimes we didn't bother cooking at all, just ordered takeout and watched old black and white films on his aging television. But it wasn't the food that mattered. It was what happened in between bites. The lessons, the quiet strength, the way he taught me about justice, not just law. He told me that power without empathy was dangerous, that fairness demanded patience. Those dinners built me far more than any classroom ever could. When I graduated from the University of Oregon Law School, he sat front row, camcorder in hand, wearing the same robe he'd worn on the bench for 30 years. My parents mailed a card that read, "Proud of you. Keep it up." 2 sentences. No call. No visit. By then, I'd long since stopped expecting anything more. Landing my first position in the King County District Attorney's Office was partly Grandpa's doing. He called in favors, vouched for me, said I had his discipline but my grandmother's heart. I was determined to prove him right. I became the kind of prosecutor no one could outwork. First in, last out. The one who volunteered for cases others avoided. Complicated financial frauds, political corruption, corporate theft. My world shrank to fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and file folders stacked taller than my desk. By 30, I was handling high-profile cases that splashed across the Seattle Times. My social life was non-existent. 70-hour weeks became normal. I lived off cold sandwiches, black coffee, and the rare thrill of seeing justice delivered to people who thought money or charm could shield them from consequences. The only constant outside work was Grandpa. Sunday dinners never stopped. Even when he started moving slower, he refused to cancel. Routine keeps the mind sharp, he'd tell me, though I suspected it was his way of saying, I need you here. I needed him too. One evening when I was 28, my phone rang, Carla's number. I hadn't heard from her in years. She wanted help, said Ethan was tangled in some legal issue over a failed resort investment in Tacoma. I told her I was a criminal prosecutor, not a civil attorney, and even if I were, I wouldn't lift a finger for Ethan. She called me ungrateful. I hung up before she could finish. When Grandpa passed away at 87, peacefully in his sleep, that old house in Portland felt unbearably empty. But I wasn't the lost 18-year-old who'd cried over tulip bulbs. I was 32, standing on my own, carrying his values like armor. A week later, the will was read in a lawyer's office overlooking the Willamette River. I expected maybe his watch, a few keepsakes, maybe the house. What I received instead left me breathless. He left me everything. The house, the savings, the investments, over $3 million in total. Everything he'd earned in 4 decades on the bench. Alongside it, the attorney handed me a sealed letter addressed in Grandpa's steady handwriting. My dearest Clara, you earned this not through blood, but through loyalty. You showed up when others did not. You loved when it wasn't convenient. You're the best of both of us. I cried, not from grief, but from the quiet validation in those words. Then the attorney slid another envelope across the table. Documentation. Bank records. Proof that Grandpa had sent Carla monthly payments since I was born. Over $800,000. Emails begging for more. Texts promising visits that never happened. Letters from Ethan requesting investments in one failed scheme after another. Your grandfather knew they might contest the will, the attorney explained. He wanted you to have evidence ready. Exactly 30 days later, my phone rang again, this time from my lawyer, Thomas Beckett. Carla and Ethan had filed a lawsuit claiming undue influence and mental incompetence. They accused me of manipulating an old man into leaving me his fortune. I laughed, out loud. The irony was too sharp to ignore. They still saw me as that abandoned child, the easy mark, the girl desperate for approval. They had no idea I'd spent 10 years dismantling the lies of people just like them in court. And that's how I ended up in Judge Lawson's courtroom, where the truth and my past finally collided. Judge Lawson, who'd once clerked for Grandpa decades ago, knew exactly who I was the moment he saw my name on the docket. For transparency, he said, voice steady but formal. I had a professional relationship with Judge Robert Hayes early in my career. If either party objects to my presiding, speak now. Carla's attorney, Richard Monroe, leaned over to whisper furiously to my parents. They hesitated, exchanged nervous looks. Finally, Monroe straightened his tie. No objection, Your Honor. Big mistake. Monroe's opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulation, fiction cloaked in sentiment. He painted Carla as the devoted daughter, torn from her father by overbearing grandparents. He described Grandpa as a grieving widower, too heartbroken to think clearly after Miriam's death. This will, Monroe declared dramatically, does not represent Judge Hayes's true wishes. It reflects the influence of a lonely young woman who saw opportunity in an old man's weakness. I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the defense table, a lifetime of courtroom training keeping me composed. Then Thomas Beckett, my attorney, rose, calm, deliberate, confident. No theatrics. Your Honor, this case is not complicated, he began. Judge Hayes was meticulous, principled, and deliberate. He left his estate to the one person who earned it, not through manipulation, but through presence. The evidence will show the plaintiffs received over $800,000 from him and repaid his generosity with absence. The air in the courtroom thickened. Monroe called Carla first. She stepped up in a black dress, hair neatly pinned, the perfect picture of sorrow. She clutched a tissue like it was a prop she'd rehearsed with. My father was everything to me, she said, voice trembling. When he offered to care for Clara while Ethan and I got settled, I thought it was temporary, but they kept her from me. They turned my daughter against her own mother. A sympathetic murmur rolled through the gallery until Thomas stood for cross-examination. His tone was polite but surgical. Mrs. Turner, he began, you voluntarily left Clara with your parents when she was 3 months old, correct? Carla shifted uncomfortably. I was young. I just needed time. He nodded. Of course, and according to your father's calendar, you visited 4 times in Clara's first year, Christmas, Easter, her birthday, and 1 Saturday in July. She swallowed. That sounds right. And during that same period, he continued, sliding a binder toward her, your father sent you $3,000 every month for 20 years. That's over $800,000. You took every payment, correct? Yes, but Thomas didn't let her finish. And in the last 10 years of his life, you saw him 8 times. Less than once per year. Her lips tightened. I had responsibilities. Right, Thomas said coolly. So you claim to be a devoted daughter. Tell the court. When was the last time you saw your father before he died? Silence stretched. The courtroom waited. It was his 84th birthday, she finally whispered. 3 years before his death? Yes. You stayed for 90 minutes and left before dessert. Didn't see him again until the funeral, correct? Carla's voice cracked. I think so. Thomas let the pause hang heavy before delivering the final blow. Isn't it true that when your father retired and said the monthly payments would continue, but no additional money would be provided, your visits stopped altogether? Carla's tears returned, but this time they looked rehearsed. Thomas closed his folder. No further questions. The courtroom was silent, except for the judge's pen scratching across the record. Next came Ethan's testimony. And if Carla's performance was bad, his was disastrous. He stumbled over dates, couldn't recall basic facts, and failed to name a single school event he'd attended. When Thomas projected photos of my high school and law school graduations, Grandpa and Grandma beaming in the front row, the empty space where my parents should have been was louder than any argument. Where are you in these photos, Mr. Turner? Thomas asked. Ethan shifted. I might have had work. You didn't come. Not once, Thomas said evenly. You missed her milestones, her successes, her entire life. And now you want half of the estate earned by the man who actually showed up. The words hung like smoke. Monroe objected, but even he knew it was useless. By the time Ethan stepped down, their credibility had collapsed like a bad alibi. Monroe, clearly desperate to recover ground, tried pivoting. He called Dr. Alan Mercer, a psychiatrist who'd never met my grandfather. On direct, Mercer claimed that, based on letters and testimony, Grandpa had shown signs of depression and possible cognitive decline after Grandma's death. Thomas stood for cross. Dr. Mercer, just to clarify, you never treated Judge Hayes personally, correct? No, but I reviewed correspondence and statements, and you found no record of depression or dementia in his medical files? That's correct, but grief. So, you diagnosed a man you never met with a condition not found in his records, and used that to question his mental competence to draft a will. Mercer's mouth opened, then closed. That's not... Thank you, Doctor, Thomas said smoothly. No further questions. Our witnesses were unstoppable. Judge Evelyn Morris, a former colleague of Grandpa's, testified he'd been as sharp and deliberate as ever, right up until the end. Margaret Lynn, his estate attorney, confirmed he'd meticulously updated his will 2 years before his death, fully aware this lawsuit might happen. Every document bore his careful notes, signatures, and margin comments. Then it was my turn. Thomas led me through it all, the 32 years between that October morning on the porch and the courtroom I now sat in. Every missed holiday, every broken promise, every empty seat where a parent should have been. I kept my tone steady, not emotional, just factual. I'd learned long ago that truth doesn't need theatrics. When Monroe rose for cross-examination, I could see him trying to find a weak point. Ms. Turner, he began, pacing dramatically. Isn't it true that you had complete access to your grandfather's finances before his passing? I managed some of his accounts for convenience, I replied evenly. He asked me to help when online banking confused him. So, you could have influenced his financial decisions? I could have, I said, meeting his gaze. But I didn't. My grandfather was one of the most independent people I've ever known. He didn't do anything he didn't want to. Monroe's smile was thin. You loved him, didn't you? Deeply. So love was your motive? I leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. If love was manipulation, counselor, then maybe you should tell your clients to try it sometime. A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. Monroe flushed red. No further questions, he muttered. When I stepped down, Thomas gave me a quiet nod. Approval, respect, maybe even pride. Judge Lawson called for closing arguments. Monroe clung to his narrative like a drowning man, painting Carla as the forgotten daughter, Grandpa as a lonely widower, me as the ambitious prosecutor who saw her chance. But even he sounded unconvinced by his own performance. Thomas's closing was the opposite. Calm, unhurried, built entirely on evidence. This case isn't about inheritance, he said. It's about consistency. Judge Hayes rewarded presence, not DNA, not obligation, but commitment. The plaintiffs want to rewrite history to cover their absence. The evidence refuses to cooperate. Judge Lawson didn't take long. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and spoke with the authority of someone who'd known my grandfather well. The court finds the will valid. No undue influence, no incompetence.
The evidence shows a clear pattern. Abandonment by the plaintiffs, loyalty by the defendant. The estate stands as written. Furthermore, attorney's fees are awarded to the defense. This case should never have been brought. The gavel cracked once. Clean. Final. As the courtroom emptied, Carla approached me, tears streaming down her face. Clara, please, she whispered, reaching for my arm. Can we talk? I'm your mother. I stepped back. No. You're the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Miriam Hayes. You had 32 years to show up. You chose not to. Her sobs followed me as I walked away. But I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Grandpa had given me one last lesson, that love isn't owed, it's earned. That family isn't defined by shared blood, but by the people who never stop showing up.
3 years after the trial, I was sworn in as a district judge at 33, one of the youngest in Washington State's history. On my first day on the bench, I wore Grandpa's old judicial robe. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave and the cedar wood from his office. At 38, I received my appointment to the Washington Supreme Court, filling the same seat Grandpa once held. The weight of it wasn't lost on me. I wrote my first landmark opinion that year, redefining guardianship laws for neglected children. One line from that decision still echoes in my chambers. Family is not a biological assignment. It is a deliberate act of presence. The newspapers quoted it for weeks. But for me, it wasn't just a legal principle. It was the story of my life. And his. Carla passed away 5 years after the trial. Heart complications, according to the coroner. Ethan called, asking me to attend the funeral. I declined. The woman he buried wasn't part of my story anymore. When Ethan died 2 years later, I felt nothing, just quiet closure. 20 years after Grandpa's death, the state renamed the courthouse in his honor, the Robert Hayes Justice Center. I stood at the dedication ceremony beneath his portrait, hand on the plaque that bore his name. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "Everything you hoped for." By 60, I'd spent nearly 3 decades on the bench. The robe that once felt too heavy now hung perfectly on my shoulders. When I finally retired, I returned to Portland, to the house where everything began. My last visit was to Mount Olive Cemetery, where Grandpa and Grandma rested side by side. The air smelled like spring rain. I knelt beside their graves and planted tulip bulbs, the same kind Grandma had once cradled before she fell. My hands trembled, but my heart didn't. "Thank you," I said softly, "for choosing me, for teaching me what family really means." Because that was the truth he'd spent his life proving, that blood may connect us, but love defines us. Family isn't built on DNA or obligation. It's built on who stays when life gets hard. I walked away from their graves feeling lighter than I had in years, not burdened by the past, but upheld by it. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever had to choose between toxic bloodlines and the people who truly showed up, remember this: you owe loyalty only to love that shows up, because family isn't inherited. It's chosen, built, and lived, one act of devotion at a time. That's not just my story. That's justice.